Clint Eastwood collapsed during his final interview with Johnny Carson. Not physically, emotionally. And for 45 seconds, 15 million viewers watched in complete silence as Hollywood's toughest man broke down on national television, unable to speak, unable to breathe, overcome by a truth he'd been hiding for 23 years. The date was May 22nd, 1991. Clint was 61 years old. He'd spent 3 decades playing cowboys who never flinched, detectives who never showed fear, and heroes who never cried. But on that Wednesday night in Burbank, California, America watched a man with no name finally reveal the secret that had haunted him since 1968. What caused the collapse? It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't exhaustion. It was something far more painful. A confession about his son. A son the world didn't know existed. A son Clint had kept hidden from Hollywood, from the press, from everyone because he was ashamed. Not of his boy, never of his boy, but of himself. When Clint finally spoke again after those 45 seconds of silence, his voice cracked with decades of guilt. "I failed him, Johnny," he whispered. "I failed my son because I was too afraid to be weak." And then came the moment that changed everything. Johnny Carson stood up, walked around his desk, and did something he'd never done in 30 years of hosting. He sat next to Clint and said 5 words that broke the internet before the internet even existed. "Let's bring him out here." The audience gasped because backstage, waiting in the wings, was Scott Eastwood, 23 years old, and about to walk onto the Tonight Show stage to face the father who'd hidden him from the world. If you want to know why Clint Eastwood kept his son a secret for over 2 decades, and what happened when they finally faced each other on live television, keep watching. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching this from. Let's dive into one of the most emotional moments in television history. But first, we need to go back to where the story really begins. May 22nd, 1991. The Tonight Show studio in Burbank was preparing for what would become the most unforgettable episode in its 30-year history, though nobody knew it yet. Johnny Carson was in his final season, just months away from retirement, and he specifically requested this interview with Clint Eastwood. But this wasn't a typical promotional appearance. Clint wasn't there to talk about a new movie. He called Johnny personally 3 weeks earlier and said something that made the legendary host pause. "I need to come on your show. Johnny, there's something I need to say out loud before it's too late." Johnny had interviewed Clint 7 times over the years. Each appearance was memorable for what Clint didn't say as much as what he did. The man was famous for his silence, his one-word answers, his ability to communicate everything with just a look. But Johnny always respected that. He never pushed. He created a safe space where Clint could be himself, even if that self was quiet and guarded. But when Clint made that phone call, Johnny, he heard something different in his voice. Urgency, pain, something unfinished. Johnny's producers briefed him that this interview might be significant. But even they didn't know what Clint was planning to reveal. All they knew was that Clint had requested something unusual. He wanted someone waiting backstage during the interview. He wouldn't say who, just that when the moment was right, Johnny would know. On the day of taping, crew members noticed Clint arrived 3 hours early, which was unlike him. He was pacing in his dressing room, not rehearsing, not preparing jokes, just pacing. A makeup artist later said she'd never seen him so nervous. His hands were shaking, she recalled. Clint Eastwood's hands were actually shaking. When Johnny did his pre-show ritual of visiting guests in their dressing rooms, he found Clint staring at a photograph. Johnny couldn't see what it was, but he saw Clint quickly put it in his jacket pocket. "You okay, Clint?" Johnny asked. Clint looked at him with eyes that carried 23 years of weight and simply said, "I will be after tonight. I will be." The studio audience had no idea what was coming. They'd waited in line for 6 hours, some holding signs that read, "Clint, we love you and Dirty Harry forever." They expected the usual Clint Eastwood interview, dry humor, Western stories, maybe a few behind-the-scenes anecdotes from his latest film. They had no idea they were about to witness the moment Clint Eastwood stopped being a legend and became a father. When Clint Eastwood walked onto the Tonight Show stage that May evening, he looked exactly how America expected, tall, composed, wearing a dark blue blazer and jeans, moving with that unhurried confidence audiences had watched for 30 years. The studio audience erupted in thunderous applause. Clint gave his trademark half-smile, and raised one hand in a modest wave. But Johnny Carson saw something different. As Clint approached the desk and they shook hands, Johnny noticed Clint's grip was tighter than usual. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes kept darting toward the side of the stage like he was checking to make sure someone was there. "Clint Eastwood, ladies and gentlemen," Johnny announced, gesturing to the guest chair. Clint sat down, crossed his legs, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. Johnny asked about Unforgiven, the Western Clint was directing and starring in. Clint gave his typical short answers. "It's a good script. We start shooting in July. It's darker than most Westerns." The audience laughed at his understatement. This was vintage Clint Eastwood, the strong, silent type America loved. Johnny asked about working with Gene Hackman and Morgan Freeman. Clint told a story about Morgan falling off a horse during rehearsal and getting back on without complaining. "That's professionalism," Clint said. The audience applauded. Johnny asked if Clint ever got tired of playing tough guys. "Somebody's out to do it," Clint deadpanned. More laughter. For 20 minutes, the interview flowed exactly like their previous conversations. Clint was relaxed enough to make jokes, thoughtful when discussing his craft, and characteristically modest about his achievements. But those who knew him well noticed something underneath the surface. His hands weren't relaxed. He kept adjusting his watch, and every few minutes he'd glance toward the wings of the stage. Johnny, demonstrating the intuition that made him television's greatest interviewer, sensed the weight Clint was carrying. He asked questions but didn't push. When Clint paused longer than usual, he allowed silences to breathe. He was giving Clint space to get wherever he needed to go. Then about 25 minutes into the interview, Johnny asked a seemingly innocent question. "Clint, you played so many iconic characters. The man with no name, Dirty Harry, these men who stand alone and face everything hidden. Is there any part of that which is really you, or is it all acting?" Clint's face changed. The audience could see it. He looked down at his hands. The studio grew quieter. People sensed something shifting. And then Clint Eastwood did something he'd never done in 3 decades of public appearances. He looked directly at Johnny Carson and said, "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone publicly? It's about my son." The audience gasped because nobody knew Clint Eastwood had a son. Johnny Carson's professional composure stayed intact, but his eyes widened slightly. "Of course, Clint. Whatever you need to say." Clint took a deep breath. "In 1968, I had a son. His name is Scott. He's 23 years old now, and most of the world doesn't know he exists." The studio audience gasped audibly. Even Johnny looked genuinely surprised. "Why didn't anyone know?" Johnny asked gently. "Because I was protecting him," Clint said, his voice steady but strained. "His mother and I weren't married. The situation was complicated. I thought if I kept him out of the spotlight, he could have a normal life. That's what I told myself for 23 years. Clint paused, gripping the armrest. "But that's not the whole truth, Johnny. And I came here tonight to tell the whole truth." The silence in the studio was complete. 15 million viewers across America leaned closer to their screens. "When Scott was born," Clint continued, his voice cracking, "the doctors told me he had cerebral palsy. They said he might never walk without assistance, might never live independently, might struggle his whole life." His eyes glistened. "And I was terrified." Johnny leaned forward. "Terrified of what?" "Of being weak." Clint's voice broke. "I'd built my career playing men who were never afraid, never vulnerable, never needed help, cowboys who faced down outlaws, cops who never backed down. And then I had a son who needed me to be strong in a completely different way. He needed me to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to admit I didn't have all the answers." Tears streamed down Clint's face. The audience sat in stunned silence. This was the man with no name crying on national television. And Johnny, I failed him. I kept him hidden because I was ashamed. Not of Scott. Never of Scott. I was ashamed of myself. Ashamed that I wasn't the tough guy everyone thought I was. And then it happened. Clint Eastwood collapsed. Not physically, but emotionally. His head dropped into his hands. His shoulders shook for 45 seconds. He couldn't speak, couldn't look up, could barely breathe. Nobody in the audience moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody whispered. They just watched Hollywood's symbol of strength fall apart. Johnny gave him space, letting him release 23 years of guilt. The cameraman kept filming, knowing people needed to see this, not because it was sensational, but because it was human. After 45 seconds, Clint lifted his head. His face was wet with tears. But last week, Johnny Scott graduated from UCLA with a film degree. The doctors were wrong. He proved everyone wrong, and I realized I wasted 23 years hiding the best thing that ever happened to me. Clint looked at the camera. I brought him here tonight. He's backstage, and I need to tell him I'm sorry in front of the world. I need to tell everyone that my son Scott is the bravest, strongest person I've ever known, and that I was a coward for hiding him. The audience was crying openly. Johnny had tears streaming down his face. Then Johnny did something that would make television history. He looked toward the wings and said, "Scott Eastwood, if you're back there, would you come out here? I think there's someone who wants to talk to you." For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The entire studio held its breath. And then, from the side of the stage, a young man appeared. Scott Eastwood was 23 years old, tall like his father, with the same strong jawline and piercing eyes. He walked confidently on the Tonight Show stage, and the audience immediately rose to their feet. The applause wasn't performative. It was respectful, reverent. These people understood they were witnessing something sacred. Clint stood up as his son approached. For a moment, they just looked at each other, father and son. 23 years of distance between them. And then Clint Eastwood opened his arms and embraced his son. "I'm so sorry," Clint said clearly, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Scott." Scott held his father tightly. "Dad, it's okay." The hug lasted nearly 30 seconds, but nobody cut away. The cameraman kept the shot wide, capturing an embrace that was 23 years overdue. Johnny Carson stood to the side, wiping his eyes, giving them their moment. Finally, they separated. Johnny offered Scott the other guest chair. "Scott, did you know your dad was going to do this tonight?" Scott sat looking at his father with love and concern. "No, sir. He just called last week and said, 'Come to the Tonight Show. I have something to tell you.' This was definitely a surprise." The audience laughed, tension breaking slightly. Johnny smiled. "That's some surprise. How are you feeling?" Scott took a breath. "Mr. Carson, can I be honest? My dad just told 15 million people that he was ashamed and that he failed me. But that's not true. Not even close." Clint looked surprised. Scott turned to face his father. "Dad, you think you hid me from the world, but you didn't hide from me. You were at every doctor's appointment, every physical therapy session, every small victory. When I took 3 steps without my walker, Scott's voice grew stronger. You taught me to ride horses, even when doctors said I couldn't. You put a camera in my hands when I was 12 and taught me how to frame a shot. You believed in me when everyone else was giving me sympathy." He looked at Johnny. "My dad thinks he kept me secret because he was ashamed, but the truth is I asked him to. I begged him not to tell Hollywood about me, because I didn't want to be Clint Eastwood's disabled son. I wanted to be Scott. Just Scott. And Dad gave me that gift." Clint's face showed pure shock. "You asked me not to tell people." "Yes, Dad. When I was 16, I told you I wanted to make it on my own. That if people knew I was your son, they'd either pity me or give me opportunities one didn't earn." Scott took his father's hand. "You weren't protecting yourself, Dad. You were protecting me like you always did." Johnny looked genuinely moved. "Clint, it sounds like the story you've been telling yourself for 23 years isn't the story your son experienced." Clint couldn't speak. He just held his son's hand and nodded. Scott turned to face the audience and the camera. "Can I say something to everyone watching?" Johnny nodded. "Please. I've watched my dad play heroes my whole life," Scott began. "Strong, silent cowboys, tough detectives, men who never cried, never showed fear, never asked for help. And I love those characters. Everyone does. But they're not real." He looked at his father. "Tonight, my dad showed you something real. He showed you what actual courage looks like. It's not about never being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. It's about admitting you were wrong. It's about saying I'm sorry when you need to, even if 15 million people are watching." The audience began applauding, but Scott held up his hand. "I'm not finished." The applause stopped. "Dad, You didn't fail me. You gave me the greatest gift a father can give his son. You showed up every single day. You showed up, and tonight, you showed up for me in front of the whole country. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Clint was crying again, but this time he was smiling through the tears. Johnny stood up and started applauding. The entire studio audience followed, and the applause built and built until it was thunderous. But this wasn't applause for Dirty Harry or the man with no name. This was applause for a father who'd finally forgiven himself. Johnny did something unprecedented then. He stepped between father and son and put his arms around both of them. A three-way embrace on national television. Three men, all crying, all human, all connected by a moment of pure honesty. As the applause continued for nearly 2 minutes, Johnny leaned in and whispered something to Clint that the microphones barely picked up, but lip readers later confirmed what he said. "You just changed a lot of lives tonight, Clint, including your own." The response to Clint Eastwood's interview was unprecedented. NBC's switchboard received over 50,000 calls within 1 hour. Letters poured in by the thousands. Parents sharing their own stories of shame and fear about their children. The National Alliance on Mental Illness called it the most important moment in television history for reducing stigma around disabilities. Johnny Carson later said it was the interview that meant the most to him in 30 years of hosting. Clint didn't just bare his soul. Johnny reflected months later during his retirement special. He gave permission to millions of fathers to do the same. He showed America that vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength. It's the purest form of it. Scott Eastwood went on to become a successful filmmaker and disability rights advocate. He and his father collaborated on 3 films together, each one exploring themes of redemption, fatherhood, and second chances. In interviews, Scott always says the same thing. "My relationship with my dad didn't start that night on The Tonight Show. But that's when the world got to see what I'd known my whole life. That he's not just a tough guy, he's a good man." Today, film schools show clips from that interview alongside Clint's greatest movie performances. Parent support groups reference the Clint Eastwood moment when talking about accepting children's differences. And disability advocates point to that night as a cultural turning point when America began to understand that strength has nothing to do with hiding your struggles and everything to do with facing them honestly. Clint Eastwood spent 30 years playing men who never broke down. But when he finally did, he taught the world that breaking down isn't the end of strength. Sometimes it's the beginning. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button for more true stories about the moments when legends showed us their humanity. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that being vulnerable is the bravest thing you can do. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching this from. Remember, your children don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be present. Don't hide your truth.